So thank you. Welcome once again to this wonderful event to those who have recently joined. We'll have to keep up this very dynamic pace that Ali has already set up for us. Therefore, without further ado, let's introduce Ian Anthony, the director at European Security Program at CIPRI. Please join me on the stage. Kristīne Bērziņa, senior fellow at Protecting Democracy at the German Marshall Fund of Brussels. Jing, the European Center Vice Director at the Shanghai Institute of International Relations. And finally, Jānis Sārts, the Director at Strategic Communication Center of Excellence. Let's give a round of applause to our estimated panel. So as I was trying to tease out what we would actually be talking about, it was actually very difficult, and I think that the survey we just did definitely affirmed it. So I hope that my panel is going to have the answers to it, and of course, no pressure talking about new technology and the new emerging threats. To all of you, Anthony, Jānis, Ian, we're definitely going to have a lot of things to talk about. But let's start with Jing. Maybe you can tell us about the top one thing that comes to mind with the changing of international security governance is definitely China. How is China seeing its past and present security policy and how it is going to unfold in the future?
Thank you very much. I don't know, I should say I feel great honor, or I should say I feel a little bit nervous by invited to sitting here, because from the last panel, so many people regard China as a threat. So I think actually before transformation of security governance, there must be a transformation of the understanding on security issues. So if we retrospect China's foreign policy and security policy, we can definitely see this progress in the last decade. Actually, China once held a quite traditional security understanding, very mainly based on its border. It is quite understandable because during most of the time in the last 2 centuries, China was fighting against the invasion, fighting for the independence and integrity. So after the founding of the republic, it always regarded the integrity, the sovereignty as its most important part of its security. But I think in recent years, there are some changes. The first change is that China has gradually realized that it has more and more overseas interests, which means its national interest has already beyond its border. So how to protect all these overseas interests, it is a big task for Chinese government. So if we look at the evacuation of Chinese laborers in Libya in 2011, so you can see actually it's a huge lesson for the Chinese government. And after that, we see the very rapid growth, very rapid development of our Chinese Navy and also the increasing cooperation with those foreign seaports. And the second thing, I think, second change is that China has realized that it should take more responsibilities to those newly emergent security issues. And most of these newly emerging security issues, they are non-traditional securities with a feature of cross-border or even maybe borderless, and also conducted by those non-state actors. So Chinese side believes that it should cooperate with other countries to solve all these, to give solutions to all these security issues. So if we look ahead, I think I cannot represent our government, but I think from my study, from my observation, there are few key points. The first one is, of course, cooperation. Cooperate not only at bilateral level, but also at all those bilateral platforms, which means that all these challenges cannot be solved by only one big country or some big powers, but should be collaborate with all the other countries. And second one, I think it is will be very, very important to promote the democratization of international community, which means even at those multilateral platforms, all those rule-setting process or rule reforming process should not be dominated by some the major powers, but every country should, no matter it's big or small, should have a say during this process. And finally, I think it will be very, very important to set clear borders to certain security areas, which means we should not exaggerate the risk of threatening to security to certain areas and try to use this tag providing security to some areas to ban those fair competitions between countries or between enterprises. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jānis, I think very often when we speak of China, we speak about the changing balance of threats and perspectives and opportunities, and this also comes down to technology. Maybe you can tell us what are the new threats presented by technology to governments and populations, and perhaps what is the border between innovation and destruction?
Well, I personally believe technology is neutral. It's about humans. It has always been about humans, the way humans are ready to use the technology and what are their ethical, moral, and other limits. Think of dynamite. You can use it for road construction, you can blow up people. Think of nuclear energy. You can create cheap energy, and you can create a huge disruption. I think right now what we have on our hands basically is more powerful than the nuclear energy potentially, and that is much more comprehensive. And here I think about a set of things that are coming together to change the world as we know it. I have no other way to kind of put it. And that is the combination of big data, currently machine learning, in the future more of an AI, proper AI. It's about the Internet of Things, so the data emitting from and crossing everywhere. It's about, I think also will have a strong impact from the increasing application of augmented realities and virtual realities. I think it will have tremendous impact on the social processes. And of course, down the road, there would be things like impacts from quantum computing and et cetera, et cetera. How does it relate to the security? I think first and foremost, what we already see these effects is technology changed the world, interaction between people in a ways that we did not predict it will do. So many of the existing social processes, political processes, are getting disrupted. And we don't know the recipe for it. And that's unintended. It's just the way it is. And both democratic countries suffer it. I would argue also authoritarians would feel the same kind of thing. And the responses to them vary. Second is, you can use these systems for competitive advantage and also for conflict advantage. And once again, not a system on its own right. It's the combination and interlinking of those systems. And to me, at least, the key factor to link all of that together in any cohesive way is how far we are with the AI, proper AI, rather than the machine learning as we're seeing right now. And that is going to change many things. As one Finnish researcher said, the line when machine in all forms is cleverer than human will cross only once. And if we do it wrongly, it will be a very, very bad moment for humanity. And it's kind of high words and science fiction kind of thing, but when you look at the practical possibilities of these technologies, they are not that far. It's basically not quite around the corner, but it's a longish corner, but it is still a corner that we'll have to cross. So that will have an implication. So in the future, I would see The conflict will be very much data-based. You can already do a data-based conflict right now. And these conflicts will be partly run by AI, and that will be a decision, how far do you allow? Because if you think from a very, very rational AI, climate change, solve the climate change. What might be the rational AI's response is get rid of humans, or get rid of all the good technologies we've been enjoying and getting comfort from, and that will solve the crime. Well, the potential kind of exaggerated answers, but these are the risks. And that is right now why I think there's a very, very clearly a race on who is getting ahead on that. And Europe is not doing very well. I think that's the distant third. The recent metrics say still US is at the lead, but China is closely behind. And then also there is another element, and that is if you manage to control that technology, it gives you power. And one of the things that corrupt humans most is power, unchecked power. And that is, I think, also the risk that goes with these technologies is, are we as societies, will we be able to cross-balance the power that you would have? Right now, we don't have a recipe. Facebook got power, misused it. Google get power, misuse it. That's what we have right now. And I think that is a challenge. And it's not only about national security, it is about national security, but it is also about the society, and I would dare to say also the kind of future of humans.
Thank you very much. So I was very happy that you mentioned climate, because this is exactly what me and Kristīne were discussing earlier. So we've mentioned cyber, we've mentioned various technologies, information threats, but climate is something which is completely out of our hands and we cannot control it. So how do the future energy and climate challenges actually stand in front of us, and how we're going to tackle them in the future?
You're right that energy and climate issues are a major challenge, but I don't think it's out of our hands at all. I think in many ways, the links between energy and climate and security are much more difficult to make than the links between energy, climate, and individual people. They're much closer. And when you think about the international security environment and you think about energy or climate, sometimes it seems as a proxy for broader geopolitical conflicts. You think of controversial pipelines, Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, or you think about a decision to leave a climate change agreement. These are political decisions. These are security proxies. The way to get at those, the way to solve some of these questions is really to go away from the geopolitical realm and go back to communities to try to depoliticize the situation. And the nice thing about the energy system right now is that there's a tremendous glut of energy resources and of options available to communities and to countries. We are not dependent on particular sources. I mean, there are old technologies. You can have oil or gas, nuclear fuels, coal even, in Estonia, oil shale. You have renewable sources, you have solar and PV, and ongoing there is research into wave and algae and other things. So we're not in a situation right now in which we're lacking energy resources. What we're in a situation in is perhaps a decision-making crisis, and in a situation in which we don't have a lot of good communication about what are the implications of the choices that we are making, what are the security implications of the choices that we're making. The golden triangle of energy is to have an affordable, sustainable, and secure source. Secure in the sense of reliable, but secure also, you can say, in a geostrategic sense. So how, if you're Poland, if you're choosing coal, which is cheap and local, it has air quality effects and sustainability pieces that you don't like. If you're Estonia, you have similar questions with oil shale. Gas, cleaner, not super expensive, but geopolitically fraught across Europe. So how do you make decisions that avoid all of these pitfalls? And how do you communicate the fact that making good decisions on energy will cost money? Potentially, it can. The risks with gas, the risks on energy are linked to social and political subversion, to economic coercion. Trade ties are often long-term too. And so when you're looking at energy investment decisions and many infrastructure decisions today, when you look at, the questions here about what are the technologies, they're not just what's in your, iPhone. The rest of it's also what technologies you put in your home and what are you buying when you are buying an app or a smart meter to control your heat. And it matters not just for today, not just for the lifespan of the app, but it matters in terms of the strategic relationship that you create between the countries that create those maps. If you look at Germany, you look at Germany's choice in the 70s to build gas pipelines with Russia, that has had a profound effect on German foreign policy still today. And so if we're looking at a lot of our other investment decisions, and including energy decisions today, what are we signing ourselves up for in 30 years? And that's not a decision that many policymakers are having with their populations. And if we think about governing energy and we're thinking about governing our choices, what are you paying for? Are you paying for something cleaner? Are you paying for something more geopolitically secure? And that's something we should be having. I would say, though, renewables, often you could say, renewables are more expensive, so sell them through security means. But today, even in Salaspils, which is, 20 minutes down the road, Latvia unveiled a solar thermal plant, which was going to provide hot water to Salaspils, to the city residents there. It's going to lower their bills, and they're using Danish technology to do it. So again, some of these choices involve thinking differently, thinking strategically, even geostrategically, but taking choices back down to the local level, to the communities, so that they understand what they're getting themselves into. I'd say one big security risk, though, that we think about when we think about energy or climate and the potential that new technologies will have in that is that it comes with downsides. And the same kind of downsides you'll have in terms of cyber risk, hacking, taking a device hostage, taking your home heating system hostage. All of that can happen as we're having an increasingly digitalized also energy system. Major climate benefits potentially, but also very concrete risks that could happen on an individual or on a community level. And so again, how do we look at these decisions, these practical decisions for a community and a household, and think about them holistically to include security in these? So are we willing to pay more? Are we willing to think about this long term? Are we willing to incorporate this understanding in our understanding of infrastructure in our security vision and in our strategic development? If so, I think we'll be in a good place. But again, it matters for policymakers and for communities to think about this differently.
Thank you very much. Ian, Jānis mentioned that some of the threats or some of the instruments that we have in our hands today potentially are more potent than nuclear weapons. So I immediately thought of arms control, and where does this come into play when we think about new threats now? My question is, in the face of these threats, let's say unpredictable, such as climate change that Kristīne just spoke about, and government-related, such as unyielding authoritarian leaders, for instance, how do we actually manage and come up with new arms control frameworks?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. I would just start by saying I don't think the area of international governance of security has problems which don't exist elsewhere. There are very few examples of successful cooperation arrangements if you look at the area of trade, if you look at the area of environment. Even in climate we have limited successes only. So there's a generic problem of international governance. Security is not unique in this. But if we look at the last 25 years, I would say we have seen a trajectory in thinking about international governance from a position where states came together to find ways of cooperating to solve real problems, to a period where states came together to find ways of managing their differences without really seeking constructive outcomes. And we seem to be moving to a situation where they come together in order to broadcast to their domestic public, essentially for political reasons, rather than engage in any meaningful discourse. So this arc of deterioration in the quality of international governance, I think, is something we can see in a number of different sectors, but it definitely is there in the area of security governance. I think in the near term, a large part of the effort is clearly going to be to preserve what's already there. And those are agreements which were developed in a different time, the first period I was talking about. even before that. So Chemical Weapons Convention, which is under strain, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has its own problems. For those countries that are still part of it, the Treaty on Conventional Forces in Europe, CFE Treaty. So I think preserving what's already there is probably the main focus of governments. And when they think about what to do next, they're probably not going to, I would guess, focus on the traditional forms of multilateralism, partly for the reasons that I've already mentioned. They're going to look more for arrangements that can help manage risk, that can, to the extent possible, slow down events and create communication channels that are necessary to prevent crises, rather than thinking in a more structural and long-term way. This would be my sense of where we're moving. And I think it reflects not only a change in the political environment, but also some of the things which have already been mentioned. We're now 25 or 30 years into a process where the main drivers internationally were internationalization and globalization and development of digital technologies. And now people are beginning to have second thoughts about whether we've gone too far, too fast down this road. But the practical outcome of those strong underlying trends has been to create new centers of expertise that are outside government control, new international networks and communication possibilities that are outside government control, and a general sense that governments are losing, to a certain extent, their narrative control, the possibility to control the narrative, which they once had more or less exclusive preserve over. So I think all of those things are making themselves felt in the area of international governance, and security issues are not in any way immune from that or occupying a separate space.
Certainly. You mentioned communication channels. I wonder what are these communication channels that we could be using, take into account the current relationship between Russia and the West, and do we even speak the same language?
Well, we have, through deliberate act, closed down many of the communication channels, and I think that's an issue, in my own view, mainly for Europeans. The United States, whatever the public rhetoric, has always preserved channels for communication with Russia. I'm not so convinced that if you take Europe as a whole, we have invested enough in trying to find areas of common interest. It's clear that there can't be a common political project at the moment with Russia. I think nobody expects that. But to identify very specific areas of common interest, whether it's preventing risks of terrorism, including terrorism with weapons of mass destruction, whether it's specific issues around environmental degradation in the north of Europe, whether it's whatever we can do to improve the humanitarian situation in eastern Ukraine, to look for those areas where we might have common interests and see whether we can develop communication channels around those is in our interests. It's not a charity or something which we do for Russia's benefit. This benefits us.
Thank you. Jing, in the last discussion, I think I got the impression that China is not seen so much as a strategic partner, but a strategic challenge, and this is also affirmed by the EU strategy on China that was published in March 2019. Why do you think Europe is afraid of China?
Pardon?
Why do you think Europe is afraid of China?
Okay. Actually, I think from Chinese perspective, we never regard EU. We never think that we have any security concerns with EU, with Europe. The main reason is that we don't share border with each other. So, in other words, we don't have any direct conflict or disputes against each other. China's side always regarded the EU as the strategic partnership, a partner instead of a competitor. But we also noted that in last year's the paper, the document released by the EU, is that I think it is give quite a comprehensive definition to China, not only it said that China is the competitor, but it said that in terms of some high tech, some technology-related area, it's the competitors. So we noticed that in US, they gave us this definition, it's a rival, but in Europe, just competitors. So I think competitor is a better word than rival, and also we can be competitors in many areas, but if it is kind of a fair competition with each other. But I think how to let the EU side, how to let the European countries to give a objective judgment to China's rising, it is very important. Of course, with the growth of our economic power and also military power, China will try to reach more areas to protect its overseas interest. I think it is kind of a natural process during all the rise of a country. So, but I think even during this process, we can still find a lot of cooperation with other countries and other regions. For example, if we look at what we have done in Central Asia and also in Afghanistan, we will see that not only China but also NATO and the European Union, we are all there, and we actually cooperate with each other quite well in different aspects. So I think that during this process, with Chinese rapid development and rising, I think we still can find a lot of space for cooperation.
So I think, Janis, we once again come to technology. So what or how can the development of technology actually help this other massive issue that the globe is facing, which is poverty? Can technology help rise populations out of poverty?
Of course it can, but I doubt it will. I think actually the opposite will happen, is that the ones that can adopt technology and will be early kind of integrators of these technology within their economies, into their societal processes, are likely to have tremendous benefits. Whether that will be, spread evenly, at this point in time, there's very little to suggest that. So you could actually imagine the situation where few would take enormous benefits, while many would be kind of at the losing end of it. I hope not, but once again, I don't think it's all about technology. Technology gives you opportunity. You either use it or spoil it, or use it to your individual advantage. It's, I think, back to the governance issue, and that is where I think the biggest risk lies, is that what I've said, the way the technology is right now, and it is also transforming the way we perceive the world. And the way we perceive the world is the way we act. And that is right now changing to a rate never known to humanity. And what is happening, we all see every day that typical societal processes are getting disrupted more and more. Politics is not what they used to be, because they were built in a democracy on societal processes. And that is, I think, the issue, is can we, as individual countries, as groups of countries, can we manage this disruptive nature of the technology and harness the potential for good of a technology? At this point, I don't see it. It's more on the disruptive end. And the ones that have these powers, like individual tech companies, not to mention players outside the Western area of kind of responsibility and interest, even they don't deliver to our society. As I've said, the tech companies are not held responsible for the kinds and types and effects they have on our democracy. Point. And that is current. So it is going back to the ability to govern the process, manage the process, that is going to be enormously challenging and demanding, and we're not up to the task. Can we do better? Yes. Can we use technology to help us? Yes. Will we? I'm not sure. Because, as I said, it also has this corrupting power of, giving power to few. And that's a kind of one thing that corrupts people most. And unfortunately, that is currently most at work.
Exactly, and I'm afraid maybe climate is kind of facing the same situation where few people decide on the future of the entire globe. So, Kristīne, I've heard a lot, or I think it is repetitive in the news that we see Greta Thunberg protesting in front of the Swedish parliament and then speaking in the United Nations. We see Fridays for Future movement across Europe and in the Western world. What do you think about this civic activism? Do you think it is an effective way to actually tackle climate change, and is it working?
I think we're in an era of communication and of, in many ways, the ability of individual citizens to have a bigger role on policy making than we have had in a long time. It's not really possible for an individual citizen to fully change this. The question is, how can you harness the smaller interests together to have a big enough voice to be significant at the table, whether it's setting standards in Brussels for the EU as a whole, or whether it is in the UN. Can an individual Swedish citizen change trajectories? I'm not sure. Can a well-informed Polish citizen or American citizen who might have the better access to a skeptical government at a particular point in time have more impact on this? Yes. And so I think, again, there is potential for individual use, but also it has to be organized and has to be thought out on these issues. And I think that there is, I think protests can be both helpful, they can be motivating, or they can also just be disruptive. And so I think that the question is, what comes of it? How are these individuals able to change the formal halls of power and use our institutions, which is where our democracy rests. It rests in our institutions, and how are they able to motivate the institutions to take this seriously, or corporations to take this seriously, to have some changes. And so it's a question of organization in many ways.
Fantastic, thank you very much. So, Ian, another thing that is very recurrent in the news is how we are going to deal with space. So how is arms control actually dealing with space, and what kind of role it will play in the future when it comes down to colonizing space?
Well, how it's dealing with space today is in a very limited way, of course. There are proposals out there, particularly from Russia and China, to try to use a very traditional type of multilateral diplomacy combined with legally binding agreements in space, but they don't gain any traction. The reason for that is the analysis of the specific proposals makes them look very much like a backdoor attempt to slow down or stop investments in missile defense, which the United States is determined to pursue. So I think in terms of those formal multilateral processes leading to legal agreements, it's highly unlikely that we're going to see anything very substantive. What we might see is more the kind of flexible approach to governance that I was suggesting could be more of a pattern. Nobody has really an interest in the creation of huge volumes of debris in space, because it poses a direct threat to civilian and commercial applications for communications or Earth observation. So a more pragmatic approach to avoiding damage to assets in space seems to me much more likely than the traditional forms of governance, which I don't see gaining any traction. Frankly, the military use of space is only going to increase going forward, and until we understand how that is going to look in practice, nobody's going to be sitting down to put constraints on their development programs.
Thank you. Okay, on this note, I would like to open the stage for questions from the audience. Can we have a mic somewhere, and can I have some hands already? Over here, please. There.
Hello, my name is Tomas Pildegovic, and I'm currently a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge. I have a question for Ms. Long. how would you describe the nature of China's strategic interests in the Baltic states and the broader Baltic Sea region? And is there a security dimension to these interests at this point in time? Thank you.
Another question, perhaps? Somewhere up there, please.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Carlos. I'm from the Riga Graduate School of Law. I have a question for all the speakers. During human history, there have been two stages in which self-damaging weapons have been created. One of them was the chemical weapons, as we were talking about, but later was prohibited by the Convention of the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. However, there was a second one, that was the nuclear weapons, which states just claimed to use them to deter other states. However, technology could be considered a third one, since policymakers are struggling to regulate technology, and how can these changes affect society, or is it not going to affect at all? Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps another question? If not, then we will bounce back to the audience straight. Sorry, I missed you. Another one?
Hello, my name is Anatoly Polishuk. I'm just a businessman from Latvia. My question for all guests regarding the China, that as I understand, one of the targets of Chinese Communist Party to become a new superpower, to make America weak. And as I understand, they use different mechanisms. There's the propaganda mechanisms like Chinese media and Chinese Confucius Institute. And also they use the technology like 5G internet, that issue of espionage and making European Union weak in these issues. Whether the NATO ready for these challenges from the China? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's perhaps take the questions already. Maybe let's start with Jing.
Okay.
I think two questions addressed to you.
Okay, about China's strategic intention in Baltic. If we retrospect the history, we'll find that actually in the past, the relationship between Baltic country and China is a little bit keep distance with each other. Even after your transition, China also kind of took the position to do the observation instead of get closer with this sub-region. But in recent years, more precisely speaking, in recent 5 to 7 years, we can see the very rapid development of the political development, relationships development between China and Baltic countries, because of we established a mechanism. We call it in short name, it's 17+1. The full name is Cooperation between China and Central Eastern European countries. So I think the purpose behind this is try to catch up the economic cooperation with these sub-regions, because we find that actually, though this part of Europe has a very big population and relatively rapid growth in economic area, but the proportion of the trade volume in the total China-Europe trade is just 1/10, so it's quite lower. So we hope that we can catch up this economic cooperation. So this is the main purpose why we strengthen the political relationship with all these countries. We believe that this political relationship can help promote the economic cooperation. But if we also include economic cooperation or economic interest into strategic interest, I think maybe we also have this strategic intention. But if we regard strategic this term into just like security or very high political area, I don't think China has any this kind of intention, because we know NATO is here, we know EU is here, and we know all this relationship, very close relationship, this alliance between all these countries and and US and NATO, sorry, and also we know this very this relationship between all these countries and Russia. So I don't think that we have any political ambition or security ambition in this sub-region. Thank you.
Would somebody else like to take the question?
I can, yeah.
On China?
Or by either?
I will take on the technology as a kind of something to be banned or controlled. Well, I think neither would be possible. Not to say that technology currently is so comprehensive. There's no only dual use. There are multiple use technologies. Like AI can be used for anything that there is, almost. Starting from road traffic to medicine to national security everywhere, like cyber attacks or cyber defense. So it's too multifaceted to really apply the same regime of control. Secondly, it is mostly championed by the companies, private companies. It's not as it used to be the government's prerogative, so there's very little. What I think we have to increasingly try to build the safeguards within these technologies so that they don't have the kind of disruptive power they might actually produce. And unfortunately, our analysis of the technological impact on us as humans and human society lies on our previous experiences. But what I see de facto is that challenges any previous experience we've had. For instance, let's take my area of interest, that's how technology influences human mind. Well, basically right now, increasingly, technologies, some of them, can almost take over the behavior control of humans. That has never been possible in history. So applying kind of old knowledge into trying to understand how you kind of control that is not going to work. And that's one of the challenges for the governance that we have. A bit on China. I think I'm tempted to say here, which is also from my piece, is deeds speak louder than words. And what has been, I think, the recent dynamics there is people have increasingly looked at deeds. And that's what changed this dynamic.
Thank you. Kristīne?
A bit on the technology and also a bit about the new cooperation between China and Europe. Something that is important as we take on the new challenges, whether they are technological, whether they are different regional dynamics, is to make sure that we maintain our values, our democratic freedoms, our democratic processes, and ensure that they remain as robust moving into the future. So when we're looking at technological governance, the problem, it isn't a matter of bans, and often the word regulation is being thrown about, how do we isolate these threats? The question is, how do we apply the protections we have instituted in the traditional space, in traditional media, in traditional paper voting ballots? How do we apply the protections we have that buttress, that are the basis of our democracy and of our societies into a new scenario? Similarly, as we have different regional interests and different relationships that we build, how do we make sure that the things that make us who we are, the democratic values that make us who we are, how are those protected and how are those held sacrosanct in various new formats? And if we are able to maintain our own integrity, we will be far better able to assess and to anticipate and also be resilient against the downsides of numerous challenges.
If I may add here, I think the speed of urgency, I think that's not something for a future. I always ask this question. Do you think if Mark Zuckerberg decided to run for US president, that would be a free and fair election? You have all the data you can imagine within a Facebook, and nobody can go and cross-check how it is being used. Is it free and fair election? It is right now possible. So we're speaking as if it's some kind of future. It's today.
Definitely. Ian?
So I agree very much with the previous points, and I think it points really to what was the conclusion of the first panel of this meeting, the urgent need to not only preserve but further consolidate the Euro-Atlantic community as a coherent entity. And I think that is the starting point for allowing us to deal with self-confidence with countries like China. On the point that was raised about China, this is not something which is, I think, driven necessarily by the objectives of the current Chinese government. As China develops the human resources that it has, it is going to be a superpower regardless of who is in power. It's really China is going to be a superpower, and that's a fact. It's not dependent on the nature of the specific regime, and we have to have the self-confidence to interact with China in the future. On the question of historical stages of self-damaging weapons, actually I'm not sure I would put chemical weapons into that category. Of course they are terrible weapons, no question, but they don't have this capacity to eliminate humanity in the way that nuclear weapons do. There is another category of weapons which has never really been developed, and that is biological weapons, which are also banned by a multilateral disarmament convention. And I think if you think of the four things which could be a threat to humanity as a whole, destruction of the climate, destruction of the environment, use of nuclear weapons on a strategic scale, the fourth one would be pandemic disease. And the reason biological weapons were not developed, I would argue, is less to do with the convention, which is very weak, and more to do with the fact that the weapons couldn't be made to conform to some characteristics of the military values. They couldn't be targeted in specific ways, they couldn't be preserved and used in the battlefield in a timely way. A lot of the research which is going on into reducing the risk of pandemic disease is leading to very rapid change in the area of life sciences. And that is perhaps making it less clear that a malicious actor would not see utility in developing biological weapons. So I think this is another area of technology where we actually should pay much more attention than we do today. The convention that we have now is weak, it's neglected, and it's constructed according to very old-fashioned principles exactly of banning technology. It's not adapted for managing risk, which is the problem we face today. Nobody has an interest in banning technology development in life sciences. It's essential. But managing the associated risks is a neglected problem.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Now we will have to stick to a very rudimentary schedule and finish very shortly. So the very last question to you all, from the point of perspective of your disciplines, which you work on a daily basis, what are the three main key points to better the international security governance? I know it's a basically impossible task, I'm very sorry, but I think you have the answers, so please. Jing, you start.
Three key, I think, from my point of view, I think we should involve China into all these global security governance. China is just like a teenage boy, grow fast, but maybe not very mentally mature. So all the other countries should try to lead this boy and get involved in all those international community and rule this country by all those international regulations. And then China can be a very good, a very important contributor to all those security issues. Thank you.
I think next 2 decades would be kind of marked by the unprecedented opportunities and unprecedented risks at the same time. I think that's what we're going to see. So the key factor is ability to oversee and manage these situations, which is going back to the governance and governance models. And I have to say that the existing governance processes are not going to work from the way I see it. We'll have to adapt to the factual realities of the way these societies are changing. If not, we'll, at least for next 5 years, all we'll see is very, very fragmented democratic space, unable to actually talk to each other increasingly, and creating self-created crises from one to another. But we have to address it because the overarching challenges will be significant. Is it the global nature? China is rising, and what kind of China will rise is, I think, an important question. The disruptions because of a climate change, disruptions because of a technology, and all that. If we don't fix ability to manage within the democratic idea, it will be a problem.
Thank you. Kristīne?
I think with a lot of the new technologies, the agents of change and action are the citizens. And I think that the ability of citizens to either work contrary to government systems, to feel disengaged from them, to there's potential for a lot of negative outcome here, whether it's on climate change or it's on technological development or privacy or security or what have you. So the ability to have a dialogue with the population, across the population, through civil society, to make sure that we are educating our citizens on what is going on in the world and having their ears and listening to them through our institutions is going to be incredibly important. Because again, the fabric of our society is very important, is essential to us in Europe, in the transatlantic space. And if we are better about taking care of this environment, of having everyone on board, we will be far better able to manage all of these risks.
Thank you. Ian?
3 points is difficult on the fly. I would say first, try to get back to using international governance to address specific problems. Try to identify areas of common interest, which would lead to a second point, which is very difficult for governments. Try not to use international governance instrumentally to promote purely national agendas. And I guess the third one, which I've tried to emphasize, is try and move to a paradigm of risk management, because trying to stop technology development is a fool's errand.
Thank you very much. Please give a round of applause to our estimated panel, and thank you very much.